Thank you. I really appreciate being here today. I think this is about the third or fourth time I've been at the Olds College in the last 2 or 3 months. And interestingly enough, I delivered the same presentation about a couple months ago. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk you through what's going on in this particular space. I'm going to give you a definition of social license, and then I'll talk a little bit of what's happening. What are the drivers of change? What's happening with the consumer? What's happening with the industry? I'll talk a little about the industry response, and then I'll talk a little bit what next steps are going to be from there. So, and I'll try to leave lots of time at the end for questions, because this is a topic that really, I find a lot of people very passionate about it, and a lot of people really want to have good conversations about that. So we want to make sure we leave lots of time for that. So social license, what is it? This is kind of the operating definition. There's lots of definitions for social license, but this is the operating definition that we like to use. So social license is the privilege of operating with we call formalized restrictions, legislation, based on maintaining public trust by doing what's right. So if you're going to talk about public trust, you got to define what public trust is, and that's just really a belief that activities are consistent with people's expectations and values. So when you think of social license, the good thing is to really look at it in terms of a scale. And I like to put this up here. On the left-hand side, we've got what's called a compliance market. This is when you got a lot of regulatory oversight. You got a lot of government involvement. There's not a lot of innovation happening over here. This is when you've lost social license. You find yourself in this kind of situation. And as you move from the left over to the right here, this is where you do have social license. This is when an industry has the trust of the consumer, they have the trust of the marketplace, they're self-regulating. So not surprisingly, you see a lot of government involvement on the left, and as you move over to the right, you see less and less government involvement. And not surprisingly, as you move to the right, the government involvement gets more supportive and enabling. And I'm going to come back to that point as I talk about what the government role is here. So let's talk about the drivers of change. So first of all, we've got a changing consumer, and I'm going to talk about the role of NGOs and how business is fundamentally changing. And this is going to be really important because it's going to have profound effects right down at the primary agriculture level. So these are some examples. This is what the consumer is seeing. So this is an example. National Geographic had ran a series of articles over the last, I guess, about 1.5 years, and the whole premise of this whole series was, okay, how are we going to feed 9 billion people, and how are we going to do it sustainably? One of the articles they had very early on was to talk about meat, and meat, as most of you know, is a heavy user of water. And this article is all about, okay, if you're going to eat meat that's using a lot of water, stop eating meat because it's using too much water. Interestingly enough, National Geographic started having this kind of viewpoint, and they started to moderate their perspective over time. It was really interesting. They started talking about GMOs, and then they realized, well, GMOs is part of the solution if we're going to feed 9 billion people. And they started to soften their stance with respect to beef as well. Another example, this is actually an advertisement. This is a cheese company, and they're making the same case. They're saying, hey, it's a cheese company, and they're trying to market themselves in terms of sustainability. And if you look way down at the bottom there, you've got milk and you've got cheese, and their argument is that they're really a low user of water. So what these numbers mean is you got 15,500 at the top for meat. That's how many liters of water it's required to produce a kilogram of meat. And so the argument here is that they're sustainable. Again, these are things that consumers are seeing. This is getting pretty dated right now, but this is the case of, it's called the lean fine textured meat. The pink slime is how it actually got quoted as. But lean finely textured meat is actually a good product. It's been USDA approved for a number of years, CFA approved as well in Canada. And in around, I think it was about 2008, it was featured in the Food Network. And a chef I'm going to talk about later, Jamie Oliver, is a famous chef out of the UK. He had a show where he took this lean, finely textured meat and he said, this stuff looks like slime. It looks like pink slime. Well, that went viral. It caught on very quickly, and pretty soon people tied it to the school lunch program, and before you know it, by about 2012, they're pulling the product right off the shelf, and a number of companies that were involved in producing this product actually went out of business. So here's an example. You have a safe product. It's approved by CFA, it's approved by FDA, and it was being pulled off the shelf because a lot of the perspective that was being put on top of it. So why is this happening? I mean, you guys are sitting here and I'm sure you're thinking, wait a minute, Agriculture is safer than it's ever been in terms of food safety. From an environmental perspective, we're better stewards than we've ever been. We've never been bad stewards of the environment, but we're even better stewards than we ever have been. So why are people so questioning agriculture? Why is agriculture not enjoying the kind of trust it has in the past? Well, there's a number of factors, and this is the first one, is producers or consumers are increasingly distant from the farm. We're probably, your average consumer out there is probably about 4 generations off the farm. This was a survey that was done at Ipsos Reid in 2012, and you can see people are asked, you know, how much do you really know about agriculture? And not surprisingly, only about 7% consider themselves really knowledgeable about agriculture, but that doesn't stop anyone from having very strong opinions about where their food comes from and how it's produced. Conflicting philosophies. The average consumer out there, when they think of a farm, they think of, you know, the red barn and the green field, you know, something we probably saw in agriculture back in the 1930s, but that's the image people have of agriculture. And that's, you know, opposed to what we see, the reality of commercial agriculture today. But they've got probably this conflict of this image they have in their mind. When they think of farmers and they think of farming, they think of the image on the left there. But they're becoming increasingly aware of this, and it's really creating a little bit of a conflict in their mind in terms of reconciling that. So, I think probably the biggest driver here is, this is work that was done by the Center for Food Integrity, and it points to the fact that consumers are becoming increasingly skeptical of institutions. And this isn't something that happened overnight. It goes back about 4 decades, and probably the key pivotal point I'll call is probably about 1968. And right around that time we saw, well, Watergate was the big issue that happened then. We had Enron scandal, we had a number of scandals that happened since that time, but over time has eroded the trust that consumers have in institutions. So we really have what we call a modern and a postmodern. So if you go before 1968, we saw the authority granted by the office. We had broad social consensus driven by, I got wasp males, but it's really a small group there. And after 1968, authorities more being granted by relationship. This is going to be important again and again and again. People don't trust institutions, so who are they going to trust? They're going to trust people who share the same values as them, people who they think are like them. And that's going to become increasingly important. From a communications point of view, we've gone for communications was a mass communication from one single source of authority to what we see in social media today, which is communications informal. It's coming from many sources. Right? So these are all fundamental change, and what happens is it changes people's perspective. So when you look at agriculture, agriculture is increasingly becoming more consolidated. There's more integration going on in agriculture. It's becoming more industrialization. So it's looking more institutional to consumers when they look at agriculture. So if they don't trust institutions, who do they trust? And you know, this is this was a survey that was done Ipsos Reid again, 2012. And you can see over time, university environmental science professor, now the belief is still very high. I mean, they started at 74% and they're still at 60%. That's still pretty good. But you can see it's starting to drop a little bit. And if you go down to the bottom, the environmental advocacy groups, although don't have near the same trust that scientists do, is beginning to increase, right? What's interesting is you go to farmer rancher in the middle, it's about the same. I'm going to come back to that again and again. People still have their trust of farmers, and I'll explain later how you can take advantage of that. Animal welfare, just another example, same type of thing. You can see trust in veterinarians is beginning to be eroded. Science professors, again, being able to erode it. But down to the bottom, you see the farmer rancher. Well, in this case, it's dropped a little bit. But not surprisingly, government agency, trust in that has eroded quite a bit. So again, don't trust institutions, don't trust professions or people that are connected to or associated with those institutions. So if you don't trust institutions, who do you trust? Not surprisingly, you're going to trust people who, again, are like you, people who share your values, people have a lot of common things with you. So at the very top there, you see that we got friends, word of mouth, those types of things. That's the source people have the most trust in terms of getting the information. Farmers, again, way up there. Farmers have a lot of trust. Again, because when people think of farmers, they still think of that red barn and the green field, right? So they still have that image about it. So those are a number of drivers. I think the other thing we need to think about is consumers becoming more and more tribal. Again, if you don't trust institutions, you're seeking out people who have common values. You begin to form, these tribes where you share a number of common beliefs, and anybody that challenges those perceptions, your perception becomes reality very quickly, and anything that challenges that perception, you're going to be very distrustful of that. You're going to be you're going to push that away a little bit. So this fundamentally changes the way we communicate, and so I'm going to give you an example of one tribe. It's a mum tribe, and I don't mean to pick on mum's tribe, but the reality, our mums still make the largest purchasing decisions in terms of groceries. So this was a Center for Food Integrity had done a focus group, and they had asked one of the mums in there, and it's Heidi, and they said that the question was, what information source do you use to come to conclusions that GMO are dangerous? And one of the mothers there said, well, I'm part of a mums group, and when there's a big consensus, I think there's something there. You don't need doctors, scientists confirming it when you've got hundreds of mums. So just an example of how tribalism works. And so what we have is the way we have to communicate has fundamentally changed. Okay, so it's not going to work. What we've done in the past, when people were skeptical of things, you bring all kinds of facts, you bring all kinds of scientific evidence forward, and you put it on them, and you say, trust me, because I'm hitting you over the head with all this information. That will not work, and that's the key. And this is based on research that's done out of real sociology down in several universities down in the United States. What they're saying is, you've got to get their trust first. You've got to have a connection with them. You have to show that my values are your values. And once you've done that, then they will listen to your facts. And that's really a lot of the information that's coming out. So it's a different strategy as to how we have to do that. And I'm going to show you later how a lot of people do this really effectively. So this just really reinforces the same point again. This was, again, the journal Real Sociology. And it just showed that people's shared values, when it comes to what consumers trust, shared values are 3 to 5 times more important than information. Right? So we're going to sum up this whole section. We got consumers that are becoming more removed from agriculture. They're becoming distrustful of institutions. We got relationships and values for information. We got more technology happening out there, and a lot of information pointing out the negative, and not so much the positive. I can talk about the role of NGOs for a second. This is I like to throw this up here. It's a famous martini glass, and if you look at the bottom, I actually took this right out of World Wildlife Federation. This is the deliberate strategy that they follow. And if you're WWF, are you going to focus 1 billion producers worldwide in terms of getting your agenda across and your information and your message, or are you going to target 6 to 7 billion consumers up there? No, what you're going to do is put all your energy into 300 to 500 companies that probably reach 80 to 90% of those consumers out there. And WWF has done this very effectively. We've seen partnerships in the past with Coca-Cola. You saw the little panda bear on there. Starbucks coffee is another example where WWF has had a great partnership, and it's all around the idea of fair trade, ensuring that workers are treated equitably. And they've really leveraged their position, their agenda very effectively by doing this. So what really they're trying to do is they're trying to move beyond the government regulation, which is the minimum standard. They want to shift the whole distribution curve out here. We have voluntary standards that go above and beyond. So again, very deliberate strategy by WWF. Business is changing. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this is based on a lot of research coming out of Harvard University. They are saying that the very definition of business, when you think about historically, we always think of business with profits versus loss. That's changing fundamentally. There's now companies think of themselves, they think of corporate social values. They think of social responsibility. So you got this triple bottom line coming with a lot of companies internationally, and that's what's driving a lot of their decisions. So capitalism 2.0 is what I call it. If you look at the column on the left here, this is what we traditionally think in terms of capitalism. It's about maximizing shareholder growth, return on investment. It's about stock market, big financial institutions, and we move from that to creating stakeholder value, including the environment. Market focus, environmental and social impacts externalized, and what I mean by that in the traditional sense, there's an environment out there and you're a company trying to make profit. Well, the environment is everyone else's problem, that's not your problem. What we've moved to in capitalism 2.0 is it's internalized. So you now are taking responsibility for environmental stewardship because that's all tied up in the brand that they have for the company. So just to reinforce this point, this was it's a survey done of 766 CEOs back in 2010. It was a UN study that was done. And it really asked them, what's most important to you? What are the bigger drivers in your mind? And about 72% had talked about brand recognition, 44 talked about revenue, employee recruitment engagement was very important up there too. This one tells a story a little bit better. This was the same study, same number of CEOs, same CEOs in fact, done in 2007, 2010. And it really was about how the mind shift is changing. So you see in 2007, 72% of CEOs thought sustainability should be fully embedded in strategies. And by 2010, those same CEOs, 96% agreed with that. And if you go down, you can see really, again, the only reason I do this is to show you how businesses' mindset is changing. So I talked about the consumer earlier. They're becoming, they're removed from the farm. They're skeptical of institutions. They're tribal in their thinking. Add to that the fact that you've got NGOs becoming more strategic, and you got the capitalism is fundamentally changing. These are all the drivers. And when you ask the question, how did we get to this point where consumers are suddenly questioning agriculture? It's all these drivers in combination are getting us there. So, how is industry responding to this? And there's lots of examples of how industry is doing this very effectively. So this is actually a free-from program. It's Sobeys. Sorry, not Sobeys. This is Superstore. Superstore is under Loblaws. Loblaws is sort of the banner company that owns a number of companies, a number of banners, including Superstore. Free-from program it's pork that was raised without hormones. And this was a program, I was actually involved in the development of this program. It was a feed company that they did out of Eastern Canada. It's a very effective program. It talks about how it's exclusively sourced in Canada, but this program is so successful, I think they're not going to be able to stay it for much longer. They're going to have to go to US sources. But when you look at the package and the product, what do you see there? You see a farmer. Remember those surveys I did earlier when people are looking at values and looking at who they can trust and connect to? Farmers were still well up there. So when they put the package of the farmer, they're really putting out the values. These are family values. This is my family. This is how I'm connecting to you. And this is how they really try to gain that trust of the consumer. This is Superstore again. This is the first time I've seen a program probably this aggressive on traceability within the cattle industry. And this one, it's really about, they're looking at cattle that are approved in the feed yards, the DNA sampled and all sourced all the way through the supply chain. So it's a very aggressive program, and it's all about transparency, right? This is a picture of Walmart. It was actually taken, I think I took it in Hamilton. And really what they're trying to do here is, again, they're trying to connect to the values that consumers actually value. This guy here is Jamie Oliver. I talked about him earlier. He's the guy behind the Pink Slime episode. So Sobeys, who took this guy who was a very vocal critic of the food industry, and they said, well, why don't we bring him under the tent, right? Why don't we actually use him to our advantage? And that's what they've done here. And you can't see it, but I've blown it up here a little bit. That's the wording that's there. And he really, in this, he says, I always ask myself, would I feed that to my kids? And I can wholeheartedly say that I would. So again, my values, your values, right? It's really getting that trust and that connection is what they're trying to do. Lots of other examples. I won't spend too much time on this. This really highlights how we've seen an explosion in environmental labels out there. McCain's, was really trying to jump on the sustainability. I know we work with the potato growers very closely with both McCain's and Frito-Lay, getting their program together. You guys are probably all familiar with A&W, so you've seen these commercials all over the place. And really what they're trying to do is raise without hormones. What's interesting is A&W has not changed their buying practices one iota, okay? A&W has always sourced their beef from Australian cow meat, largely. A little bit of US cow meat mixed in there as well. But you think about it, when you've got cow meat, you're not adding growth promotants, you're not adding beta antagonists, because there's absolutely no commercial value in doing that. But someone in their marketing department woke up one day and said, hey, wait a minute, we can claim that this is raised without antibiotics. Very effective program. It's done very well. And of course, it's forced the hand of these guys, right? McDonald's. So McDonald's has now, when you look at A&W, you look at McDonald's, McDonald's can't just go out and buy cow meat. They operate in a totally different scale than A&W does. There's not enough cow meat in North America for McDonald's even to supply its Canadian buyers. So what they have to do is they have to work with the entire population. And they've always been very much focused on Canadian product. It's always been outsourcing on that. So McDonald's, the pilot project, first of all, McDonald's committed to sustainable beef by 2016. They want to begin buying sustainable beef by 2016. They launched a pilot project. It's the first of its kind anywhere in the world. Number of reasons they picked, it's actually Canada as a pilot, but a lot of it's being done in Alberta. One of the reasons they picked Canada because you've got a pretty simple supply chain. It's a pretty closed loop one. For McDonald's, you got all the beef, all the trim comes from you got JBS in Brooks, you got Cargill in High River. It goes from those two plants to the patty plant in Spruce Grove out to every McDonald's restaurant in Canada. So yes, if any of your friends ever ask you, is McDonald's beef Canadian? Not only is it Canadian, it's Albertan. So all of it. So it was a great opportunity for them to do this pilot because there's no leakage coming out in terms of imports. The other reason they looked at it is because, as I'll explain later, the beef industry had itself well organized in terms of being able to determine what sustainability means. But I'll come back to that. So their outcome there, it's really about, they're trying to strengthen the supply chain's ability to deliver safe, sustainable, assured supply. McDonald's philosophy has always been that they want to see their suppliers be successful. And they're doing that very much with this, as I'll explain later, with this pilot project. Moving away from McDonald's, so it's not just them. There's a number of other companies out there, Unilever, Nestle, Kellogg's, Mars. These are the largest companies in the world. All of them have some kind of sustainability platform that they want to talk about. For example, Mars, Mars is actually the biggest producer of confectionery. That's candies and chocolates and those types of things. They talk about quality, responsibility, mutuality. What they mean by mutuality is they want to ensure that everyone in the supply chain can share in the value, but more importantly, that we don't see exploitation happening of producers, particularly in third world countries. So this is an ugly slide, but it's really to make a point. There's a lot of products out there. There are a lot of different streams, but really it comes down to about 5 or 6 or 7 companies internationally that probably control the distribution of all food that we all see, probably to 80% of the population across the world. In every single case that we've got up here, every one of these companies wants to develop a sustainability platform, and in every single case they see primary agriculture as the biggest footprint within that platform. So, where this, I've done this presentation a few times and people try to argue this is a niche market. It's not a niche market. It's not an academic exercise anymore. This is very real, and it's hitting at the broad commodity level. It's affecting at every level. So, how does primary agriculture take the conversation back? Well, they've been very active doing this. So here's a good example. This is the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. So this was a company, it was actually driven by McDonald's, to be quite honest. They're the ones that put this group together. But the idea is you had McDonald's, you had Walmart, you had Unilever, you had Kellogg's, you had all these big companies. And they said, okay, we want sustainability, but we can't have McDonald's going to the producer and asking for one set of criteria, then you have Walmart coming and asking for a different set of criteria, and on and on and on. It just isn't going to work. So what they did is they decided we're going to get all the big players together and we're going to come to some kind of agreement at a very high principle level as to what it is we mean when we talk about sustainability. So their first meeting was in Denver, I think in 2010. They had another meeting in the fall in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and that was in 2014. These were all the companies that were involved, and actually I don't have them all up there, but what you see is a cross-section of the biggest companies in the world, but you've also got all the commodity associations. Canadian Cattlemen's Associations is part of that as well, and we've got the non-profit groups, or what they call civil society groups. I like that name. These are the groups that are really about, those are your WWF, that's Nature Conservancy Canada, a number of the conservation groups. And all these groups are coming together with the principles of sustainable beef. And there's 5 of them. One is around natural resources. That's really about the environment, and there's a number of things in there. They talk about, whether it's manure management, or it's the quality of your soil, it's the quality of the water used on the farm. That's part of it. People and community. This is an interesting thing. They wanted to be seen as good, I guess, good citizens in the community, and this is really about how you treat your workers, and not as much of an issue in Canada as it is in third world countries, but in Canada, it's really about the kinds of rights that are available to workers. Animal health and welfare is the other one, and that's kind of self-explanatory, but that's really about food is about food safety. Efficiency and innovations, they realize if we're going to do these other four, efficiency and innovation has to be a big part of that conversation, and so there need to be a lot of investment in research in terms of getting the standards and the science behind what we're doing here. And again, if we're going to have profitability right through the supply chain, we've got to ensure that all of our suppliers, including the producers, are as efficient as possible. So that's the National Roundtable Sustainable Beef. We have a number of national tables as well that have been developed. There's a Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. We've got one in Australia. We've got one in the US. We've got one in Brazil. And what the Canadians Roundtable's responsibility is to take those principles that we saw at the Global Roundtable and apply it to Canada. How would that work? So who's on this one? You got, again, pretty good cross-section. Loblaws, as I talked about earlier, that's probably the biggest retailer in Canada. You got from the financial institutions there. You got WWF, Nature Conservancy, JBS, Cargill, McDonald's. Oh, there it is, Canadian Cattlemen's Association. So yeah, you've got the cross section of supply chain, and amazing enough, Fawn Jackson is actually the CCA representative, and she's actually the leader of this particular group. And the purpose of the CCA is to define what sustainability means. So what have they done? They've had a few meetings. We've been July 13 was sort of their inaugural meeting. They've had meetings since then in Kelowna, and most recently Saskatoon. Actually, it was September that we were in Saskatoon to talk about a few things. Right now, it's really about how you apply the principles of the Global Roundtable to the Canadian context, and they have a number of subcommittees that are working on indicators. They're looking at verification techniques. We're going to look at lots of discussion about the governance issues, I'll call them. In other words, so how are we going to fund this group going forward? Because McDonald's has got its pilot project, but what McDonald's wants to do is after 2016, they step aside and they said, okay, this roundtable is going to run things now. And they want to set them up for that kind of success. So there's lots of discussions about how that funding looks going forward and how it's going to be audited. I mean, that's a very key question. We have a roundtable for beef, but we also have a roundtable for crops. And this group was started March 2014. Same idea, same governance structure, same questions. They're trying to define how we're going to put metrics in place, how we're going to define sustainability, and how we're going to verify that standard over time. And it's going to apply to the entire industry. So they're at various stages in terms of their development. But those aren't the only game in town. I mean, we've got dairy farmers, got the Pro Action Initiative. We've got a pilot pilot project that we've been working a bit with Alberta barley, wheat, pulse, and canola. The Canadian Field Print Initiative is something that's being led by PepsiCo, Unilever, on and on. I mean, I won't bore you too much with all these things. But needless to say, there's a lot of projects being done at a lot of the commodity levels, and they're done in unison with their buyers. And we've been able to actually provide a very supportive role as a ministry in helping, some of these associations define the sustainability. First of all, measure what their impact on the environment is, and then from there they can start to decide what the standards will be. Okay, so my head's been in the space for about a year and a half. These are some of the lessons I've learned so far going through this. Certification, verification standards should be developed with input from the entire supply chain. That's the McDonald's philosophy when they developed the roundtables. That's really what the purpose of the roundtables are about, to make sure that we've got input from the entire supply chain, so you don't have standards that are putting people out of business, right? I mean, that's key. Audits of these standards should be done by a third-party person. Those who manage data well will be successful. Data management is going to become increasingly important. And I know you guys already do a lot of data management on the farm for, between your traceability protocols and everything else. But you know, there's going to be probably more of this, and I'll talk about that a little bit. Innovation science can be key. You know, science that supports the certification standards. You know, from the consumer, you could say you're doing all these things, that's great, but what does it really mean to the environment? And so we really have to have the science behind that. Extension is going to be important to ensure that producers get from where they are today to where they need to be to supply into these supply chains. And McDonald's is not going to be doing the extension. You know, it's going to be, you know, right now they do have a company they work with called Where Your Food Comes From. But I think there's going to be some capacity that we're going to need to build within the province with a number of associations out there and organizations that will help with a little bit of that extension. And a commodity organization will have to up their communication game. That's pretty obvious. You know, the companies will take care of their own brand, but what we need to do is we need to have this more capacity for associations or someone to communicate on behalf of primary agriculture to the consumers, because you know, we can't just keep moving the bar in terms of expectations and requirements on primary agriculture. We got to keep it realistic. So we got to make sure that we're telling our story very well, and the consumers really understand the kind of job you're doing today in terms of sustainability. So agriculture, forestry, again, what are we doing? Our role is largely supportive and enabling. So you remember that at the very beginning of the presentation, I had that big sliding scale up there, and I talked about how government's role becomes less and less as you move to the right. That's pretty, I mean, the last thing we want to do as a government to put ourselves in between the consumers and the industry as being advocates, because A, we're institutional, no one will trust us. Secondly, it's just not our place. So really, we've really backed up, and the industry is clearly the lead on here, and we're playing as much as we can a very supportive, enabling role. Within the ministry, we are developing a social license strategy. That strategy is focused on 4 sort of pillars, I'll call them. One is, or I got 5, it should be 4, but it's engagement, extension, research, policy, communication. So I'll go back to a little bit. On the engagement side, it's really about, we're already doing that with all of the roundtables at the national and international levels. On the research, it's about, you know, enhancing our ability to do research behind the science behind the standards. We also need a little more research in terms of having a really good ongoing understanding of where consumers' ideas are. So all that research I've put up there earlier is from the place called the Centre for Food Integrity. Lots of discussions we're having today about having a Canadian equivalent established in Canada, so we can continue to monitor and keep on top of where that research is at. Policy, the programs we have under Growing Forward, making sure those are aligned with the needs that you guys are going to have in terms of having to make those transitions. Legislation, does the legislation we have today, is it relevant? Is it modern enough? Does it meet some of the expectations that public has, but at the same time and not too intrusive to put, you know, make competitiveness, take the competitiveness out of the industry? That's kind of the balance we have to deal with there. So some of the other things we're doing is really supporting the roundtable, McDonald's pilot project with really some of our expertise and some of our scientists on that one. Supporting activities of the crop roundtable as well, again with expertise. We've done a lot of work engaging with the associations and doing some of the fundamental research they needed to be done, and we do have an animal welfare strategy that we're in the process of developing. We've kind of taken a bit of a lead role there. So what can we do? What can the research community do? I think the science behind certification standards can be important, and I think putting a little more energy behind this is going to be key. Modeling. People have the ability to model. If you do this type of practice, what does it mean to the environment? Well, you can't go to every farm out there and figure out what it means, and it's going to be different for, you know, farmer A to farmer B to farmer C. So you have to have some way of saying, okay, if we do this practice on average, it's going to mean this. And we haven't built those yet. We don't have that ability yet. Data will be king, as I mentioned already. Applications that help farmers manage their data is going to be very important on the farm. So, you know, knowing where you are in terms of your water quality, knowing where you are in your manure management, those types of things are going to be important. So probably apps that give you a better ability to do that is going to be pretty important. What can producers do? Influencing major food companies. Remember the martini glass I put up there? Well, it worked very well for WWF. It's a great opportunity for producers. McDonald's reaches 7 million consumers a day, and they have a vested interest in ensuring that you guys as their suppliers are successful. There's an opportunity, I think, there to probably work more closely with these large companies to get your message across to a lot of the consumers out there, right? Develop metrics of food companies that make sense. That's really what the roundtables are about. So we will, I get the question every time I do these presentations, well, what's in it for us? We have no ability to pass on our cost to others, and all those things are true. But I think what you have the ability to do right now is influence the conversation, and that's what the roundtables are meant to do. So we can't have standards that are putting you guys out of business. And in fact, that's not what McDonald's wants to do. That's not what any of these companies want to do. They're not trying to put anyone out of business. What they're trying to do is meet a consumer demand, and they want to do it in the most cost-effective way that they can. And that's what the discussions at the roundtable are mostly about. So takeaway, again, social license, just to reiterate, this is a privilege to operate with minimal restrictions based on keeping public trust. Push for sustainability is increasing. With NGOs are changing, corporations are responding. We're seeing more, need for engagement, collaborate, and development of programs. And I think that's about it.